everyone, it's Suzanne. Welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to share with you my most recent reads in 2021. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. And I started this book in December. I finished it off in early January. This is the third and final book of the Davabad trilogy. And I'm not sure how to share about this without giving away spoilers. So I thought I would talk about the first book and how kind of the second ended, and then my thoughts and overall feelings about the third book. In the first book, we're introduced to Nari, who's from 18th century Cairo, and she has magical powers she didn't know about. And she ends up waking up a jinn, Dara, who takes her to the magical city of Davabad, and that's called the Brass City. And there she meets all these magical jinn and gets embroiled in the politics there. By the end of the second book, it seemed like the whole world was going to be destroyed, and I couldn't understand how they could possibly bring it back together in the third book. And I'm happy to say that this book delivered everything you would hope for. And I think it's one of the best books I've read in a long time. This did make one of my top fantasy series for 2021. I will say there was one scene in this book that really had me doing, as Oprah would say, the ugly cry. It hit my heart so deeply. I would highly recommend this book, and I'll link above to the top 5 fantasy series of 2021, and that is in there as well. One of the goals I set for myself in 2021 is to read a huge amount of fantasy series. One of those series is Leigh Bardugo's Shadow and Bone series, and this is the first 3 books in the Grishaverse world. In the first book, we meet Lena and Mal, who grew up together in an orphanage, and when we are introduced to them in the first book, they're in the army. And it turns out that Alina has special Grisha powers, which were dormant until this moment where she has to save Mal. And she becomes a Grisha in the first book. And the Grisha have magical powers. They're part of the second army. And the second army is run by the Darkling, who's super powerful. And it turns out that he might not be the friendliest sort, and he has plans of his own besides being the second army for the king. Alina's special power is summoning the sun, which is very useful, and everybody thinks that she is a savior born because there is a part of the land that is covered by total darkness that has beasts in there. So so the country that they're living in has been isolated from other countries, and the darkness, which is called the Shadowfold, stands between the country and the ocean. So trade is impacted. They're now a very poor country, all except for the kingdom, which is, of course, spending all the money on trivial things like nothing has happened. But the majority of the people living in this land have lost many of their kids and grandkids. They've certainly had enough. She is expected to save this country. So each one for me got better. The first one, I have to say, if I wasn't determined to get through this series, I'm not sure I would have made it through this book. It felt like kind of slog. I didn't care that much about the characters, and I forced myself to finish that one. But each book did get better. I'm glad overall that I read them, but I've heard great things about the next set of books in this Grishaverse world. That's the Six of Crows duology that is behind me, so I feel really good about going into those 2 books and knowing that I've read these. I've heard the Netflix series that's coming up described as being a mix of both sets of these books. So a mix of the Shadow and Bone trilogy as well as the Six of Crows duology. So for that reason, I'm really glad I read them. But like I said, they did get better each book. The next book I'm going to talk about is Keeper of the Lost Cities Unlocked. So they're referring to this as 8.5. And there's a lot of fan information in here if you want details and some fan art. But the reason that I'm mentioning it is because of this novella that was included. And I read that novella. If you're not familiar with Keeper of the Lost Cities, this was also one of my favorite fantasy series of 2021. And this is actually a middle grade series, and I fell in love with this. This is by Shannon Messenger. This series is about Sophie, who grew up in a human world, but then discovers, and she could hear the humans' voices, and she discovers that she's in fact an elf, and she goes to live in the lost cities with all the elves, and there she finds out that she has all these incredible, unusual powers as an elf. And it turns out that Sophie was created by the Black Swan, which is a side group. Sophie ends up having a lot of adventures. She has a core group of friends that relationship gets stronger and stronger, and we see her starting to grow up, and she's starting to fight the Black Swan and then the Never Seen, and there's this really great group of kids that have formed a connection as they're growing, and I absolutely loved it. There are some similarities to this series with the Harry Potter group of kids in the sense that they have a tight relationship. They're always fighting bad guys together, and we get to see them grow up and to see those relationships form, which is a lovely experience. It's one of the best things I like about this book, and I highly recommend this series as well. And this one is called The Girl Who Reads on the Metro, and this is a translation, and it was written by Christine Fury, and she's from Paris. The premise of the story is Juliet leads a very ordinary, boring life, always just kind of going to work, coming home, having her supper, watching her shows. Same old, every day. And it opens up with her noticing people on the train and what exactly they're reading. Then one morning when she goes to work, she decides to take a walk around the block, which is unusual, instead of going right into work. And she notices that there's a gate held open by a book. And she grabs the book and finds this very curious, walks inside, and is introduced to a gentleman who invites her to start giving books to strangers on the metro. She leaves that first meeting with a great stack of books, and she has to figure out what kind of book do people need. In the beginning, of course, she thinks this is like ludicrous. By chance, her coworker and her boss need a book one for her birthday and one for a showing. They rent properties, and it has amazing, wonderful results, and she starts to wonder what's happening. And I love the premise of this book. I thought I was fully prepared to love this book. I was fully prepared to buy this book if I loved it, which I thought I would. I gave this book in the end a 4.25. I wasn't overly happy with the ending. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a bad ending. It just felt like it was too simplified for the lead up in the story. I was loving where the story was going and her thought process and the experiences that she was having with other individuals. It felt very thoughtful and poetic even in moments. I felt like I was on a journey, but the ending wrap up to this felt a little bit too abrupt. Like I wanted a little bit more, even 10 pages more. So I couldn't give it a 5. The other book I'm going to mention quickly is The Vanderbeekers and the Hidden Garden, and this is by Karina Jan Glasser, and this is a middle grade book, and I'm just going to say that I absolutely love this series. It makes me happy every time we read it. When I say we, it's my daughter and I listen to the series, and we've been listening to them on audiobook. Absolutely love them, but this is part of our Family Reads wrap-up. I'll leave the link above and below if you want to check out more about this lovely series. This is The Little Bookstore of Big Stone Gap, a memoir of friendship, community, and the uncommon pleasure of a good book. And this is by Wendy Welch. This is part of my 2021 goals as well. I wanted to read a memoir, a book of essays by a woman, one every month. And this is the one I read for January. Absolutely love this. It is a 5 out of 5 for me, and I would definitely read this again. And this was an impulse buy at a thrift store. I'm so grateful that I made that purchase. Wendy Welch and her husband, who's from Scotland, decide to open a big store in Virginia of all places. And they're not from there, and they didn't know anybody there, but they found this property that they loved, and they decided to go in and create a used bookstore. And it's about the process in the first 5 years of setting up that bookstore and the community that builds around the bookstore. It felt so good to read this. If you love books and you ever dream of starting a bookstore, which I'm sure most of us who are watching these types of videos play with that fantasy every once in a while. But yeah, you'll really love this book. She describes the process really well, and she's very honest. It can be funny, and it feels heartfelt. I admit I wanted to go open a bookstore. However, She was very honest about the amount of income and the possibilities there for a used bookstore. So I might not be opening one anytime soon. The idea of the community that was created appeals to me in a big way. I did flag one comment that she made in this book. It's funny because there was probably many, but sometimes I don't remember to do that in terms of annotating till I'm like 3/4 of the way through. But this was because I definitely identified, I think writers write because it's a device to make sense of what's happening around us, to order and calm and clarify our thoughts. I've said that about why I journal and why I write. It helps me really process my life in a way I can't seem to access or put pieces together any other way. I appreciated her insight, and I hope to have a very successful business for many years to come. Then we have, and there's a theme going here in terms of books about books. This was called The Book of Secrets, a novel by Elizabeth Joy Arnold. And the premise of this book is Chloe Sinclair, who also owns a bookstore with her husband, finds this cryptic note from her husband who's kind of disappeared and left her a note. And she is trying to figure out what this note means. He's written it in a code that they used as children. And she has to go back into the first book that really got her hooked on writing because of his family when they were kids. And it was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And this book goes back and forth from her present day life to their childhood. So Chloe's from a small town, and so was her husband. And he was from the Sinclair family that they were homeschooled. It was him and his two sisters. His dad was a preacher, and they were from not sure if they were Quakers, but definitely from a very small religious sect that did not encourage marriage outside of their religious community. And she used to sneak into their home as a kid, and their mom ended up dying really young, which changed the whole energy of the house, which used to be very loving and creative. I mean, they created this whole play about Narnia. It was so beautiful and definitely encouraged the love of reading. But throughout this book, threaded through this book, is there's a tragedy. You don't know what it is, but there's some sort of tragedy that involves Chloe's and her husband's son. And so there's a mystery throughout this whole entire book that at the beginning, it really kept me turning the pages for sure. I wanted to know what happened. They kept the pace wonderful in that respect. They didn't give too much away. I certainly didn't guess it. It wasn't until almost 3/4 of the way, probably more than that I started to have a suspicion of what the ending might have been. And some would consider, I'm not going to say that. I was going to say something about the ending. I'm not going to say what the ending was. I'm going to say it wasn't my favorite ending. I think it would possibly be a great ending for some people. For me, it kind of dampened my whole experience of the book. Endings do make a difference, but it kept me engaged the whole way through. It felt very magical in terms of the kids, but the mystery was there. I kept wanting to know what was happening. Recommend this book as well. This would have been a 5 out of 5 for me if it wasn't for the ending. I was not as fond of it as some people would be. So yeah, I think I gave it like a 4.5, maybe a 4. Yeah, it's probably a 4. Okay. The final book I'm going to talk about in today's video is The Gilded Wolves by Roshani Chokshi. And this is the first book of a series. I know there's another one printed, and I think the third one's coming out this year. I didn't actually look that up. This book takes place in 1889, and it's during an exhibition in Paris. This book focuses on a cast of characters. The main character is Severin. There used to be 4 houses that were a part of the Order of the Babel in Paris, and Severin was supposed to inherit one of the houses from the Order of Babel. And in the Order of Babel, there used to be 4 houses in Paris, and at the time of this book, there are only 2 left, but as a child, Severin had been promised that he was going to inherit one of the houses, and that was taken from him. He has been determined and has been ruthlessly using his gang to steal artifacts, precious artifacts, that the Order of Babel definitely would not want him to have, and he ends up stealing the wrong thing because he is caught and he could face death if he doesn't find the next artifact that owner wanted. And I've heard this referred to, the same kind of storyline as The Six of Crows in terms of the heist. But having not read The Six of Crows yet, I'm not sure. My reaction to this book was that I did enjoy the story. There was enough mystery there in terms of Order of the Babel that I wanted to see what was behind it, what was going to be revealed, and it kept me turning the pages. I liked the characters. They were not fully developed though, because I felt like I was watching everything happen in this book from a distance. So somebody, I won't say who, dies, a character does die in this book, and I didn't have much of a reaction, and that's what I mean by distant, was like, oh, that's too bad. So I wasn't invested in these characters. I liked it enough that I will pick up the second book and see how it goes. I also had a flag 3/4 of the way through. Let's see what it says. Oh yeah. Grief snuck up on her sometimes, and she was not sure how to defend herself from the force of its surprise. I thought that was a great description of grief. Grief snuck up on her sometimes, and she was not sure how to defend herself from the force of its surprise. 2 of the books I read in January were library books that became very overdue, so I had to return them. But before I did, I filmed a little clip of my impressions of those books. Next we have One to Watch, and this is by Kate Stayman London. And B is an online fashion blogger, very successful, and she loves this show called Main Squeeze, which would be like The Bachelor and Bachelorette that we watch on TV today. And she watches an episode one night while she's had a little too much to drink, and she does this blog about how they always have size 0 models on there. Why don't they ever have real life average size people on there, or a plus size woman? And Main Squeeze goes down the toilet. The ratings go down the toilet based on this. There's a huge backlash. And in the end, the producer for Main Squeeze invites B to be the next Main Squeeze. She agrees to do this. And yeah, it's about her experience being on that type of show as a plus size woman. And while I can appreciate a lot of what they're talking about from plus size, and really I am plus size at this point in my life, and I can appreciate that in a society, a weight obsessed society that we live in today, especially in the beauty and fashion industry, it wasn't my favorite book. I rated it 3 out of 5. It wasn't my favorite read. And really, after reading this, and I read a couple more romance before Christmas, I decided this type of contemporary romance is not for me. In any case, I've read a few that I've loved and enjoyed. I seem to have picked up a few over the last couple of months that felt like more of the same, and I'm going to take a break from the romance for a little while. This month I read How the King of Elfham Learned to Hate Stories. This book is by Holly Black, and it's illustrated by Ravina Kai. They're calling it another installment to the Folk Air trilogy by Holly Black, which I loved reading last year. It almost made my top 5 favorite fantasy series of 2020. So I couldn't resist picking it up, and it is gorgeous. So this is about Carden. That was the prince of the High Court of Fairy, who ended up ultimately being the king. These are stories from Carden's childhood, as well as from his perspective when he's married to Jade. I couldn't resist this because of the illustrations, and truly I couldn't resist diving back into this world one more time. This is a lot of fun. I think it would be great if she made another trilogy in this world. Just to give you a kind of, yeah. And this for me was a 5 out of 5. It was a fun little read. Again, it was fun to go dive back into that world. Those are all my recent reads. I would love to hear about any books you've read recently that you are excited about or would love to share. Please leave it in the comments below. I'd love to share in your excitement. And I will see you with another bookish video soon.